And it's BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Tuesday. It is time for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. And you guys might be noticing that there's a couple different things about this episode going on right now. This one is a pre recorded segment because of some time constraints. However, I really wanted to keep in touch with you guys and talk to you about some of the true crime cases that are going on in the world right now. True Crime Talk Radio is a segment where I can talk about multiple subjects within a single episode, and it comes to you Tuesdays and Thursdays at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time here on YouTube. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about any of the stories discussed in this episode. And I am your host, Black Box Ned. So the first thing that I would like to do is to talk about the Karen Read trial, because this is one of the most highly publicized trials that is going on in the country. It's one of the most highly publicized true crime stories that is going on in the country. And regular listeners to Black Box Online Radio will know that I did one episode about Karen Read where I was discussing some of the basic aspects of the case. And this is before some more of these discussions that people have been having. Karen Read has been accused of murdering her boyfriend, John O'Keefe, after hitting him with her car in the snow and leaving him for dead. She was tried once, and it was hung jury mistrial, something to that effect, something to the point where she was not found guilty and she was not found innocent. So she had the opportunity to try again for another time. And this time, I do not think it's going very well for Karen Read, because people are just asking this stuff in the comment section on YouTube and on my most previous live stream when they're saying that Karen Read was framed. She was not guilty of this. And one of the biggest pieces of evidence in favor of that is that they claim that she hit her boyfriend, John O'Keefe, with her car, yet there was no DNA found on the bumper of the car. There was no DNA found on the taillight of the car. Now, the taillight of the car was shattered, but no DNA found. How could that possibly be? Well, the defense is proposing a theory that John O'Keefe actually left Karen Read, got out of the car, walked into a friend's house, got into a type of argument with the friend, and that turned into a fight, and then he was attacked by the friend's dog, and that caused a bunch of very bizarre marks on his arm. So that's what they're claiming. Now, no DNA on the bumper, no DNA on the taillight, all of that would be completely in line with the defense's narrative, except for the fact that over the last 7 days, people have been bringing the hammer down on these observations about the DNA, the bumper, as well as the tail light, when they're saying that, yes, there was DNA that was found on her bumper from John O'Keefe, specifically hair DNA. Number two, DNA was found on the tail light, according to a witness who testified for the prosecution. Okay, that person is definitely going to try and vilify this person. That person is definitely going to try and vilify Karen Read, vilify any defendant. That's what a witness for the prosecution does. But in this situation, they are using some facts. They are sticking to the evidence. And let's look at the entirety of the evidence. Number one, if there is DNA on the bumper, DNA on the taillight, it falls in line with a reconstruction model that was proposed. And I first heard this on Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi when he shared this accident reconstruction model. And that is that John O'Keefe is yelling at Karen Read as he's walking away from her car or SUV, and he falls down in the snow, and that she drives in reverse. And the car collides with his upper body, most likely around the head, because the cause of death was hypothermia partnered with a brain bleed. Now, in one of the theories is that the damage to the tail light was actually caused because John O'Keefe had a cocktail glass that he had taken from a bar that they had been at previously, and he threw the glass at the tail light, and that's what damaged it. I'm not even convinced about that if his DNA is found on the tail light. It could have also come from the accident. But as I said, DNA evidence also partnered with the fact that she drove 21 miles, or no, 27 miles. That was it. 27 miles per hour in reverse. Number three, the prosecution is also arguing that it was unnecessary to put the car in reverse to make a turn to leave. If she had wanted to get away, she could have just driven away. If she had wanted to get out of there, she could have just driven out of there. So I think that this is something that is just very, very telling about the actions and activities of Karen Read. She's looking very guilty right now. And in some ways, this case could be a slam dunk. And the programs that I regularly follow are the previously mentioned Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi. I'm also a daily and regular listener to Crime Talk, hosted by Scott Reich. And these people who talk about the Karen Read case on an almost daily basis just seem frustrated with the whole thing because they're like, all right, we think she did it. I mean, this is turning into a slam dunk. Let's just move on with our lives. But they can't because they have to follow the story until the end. And even more dramatic than the Karen Read case is the Bryan Kohberger case. However, let's also look at something else. And this is something that I think is very important to remember because on these episodes of True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, I like to begin with what I call the radio Reddit points. Lines from Radio Reddit. I like to start the days with Crime Talk and end with Radio Reddit. And there is one that I happened to encounter where somebody was talking about the stories of lawyers. Like lawyers, what is your worst experience? And thankfully, they weren't only from the lawyers themselves, they were also from people like paralegals who happen to work with lawyers and family members of lawyers. Very insightful stuff. And one person who decided to write into this Radio Reddit segment was a former paralegal who said that she worked for a defense attorney. And this person was accused of a type of sexual harassment. An adult male was harassing a teenager. And this guy had been interviewed by a psychologist or psychiatrist who on behalf of the defense team. So they knew he did it. He shared everything to the psychologist about how, yes, indeed, he committed the crimes. But of course, the defense team has to try and win the case. And one thing they wanted to do was have this female paralegal sitting next to him in the courtroom. So they could see, the people of the jury could see that he was non-threatening. And then he got on the stand and he started giving his version of the events. And he just tried to absolutely slander the name of the teenager who had accused him of harassment, saying, she knows I have money. She's just trying to extort money out of him. And he's telling all of these giant, wild stories. And then the paralegal looks back at that man's wife, and she just has a look of horror and terror on her face. And the explanation that the paralegal provided was the wife knew that he was lying. She could recognize that he actually did this, and she was married to a grown man who was harassing a teenage girl, and he's just trying to destroy the teenage girl's reputation to save his own skin. And the person who told that story ultimately decided that she's not working for a defense lawyer anymore. She actually just quit the job because of that and decided to work for a different type of law firm, real estate and financial law instead, which I'm sure it's easier to sleep at night if that's the type of case that you are choosing to explore. However, there is something that is very important to remember. And somebody even brought this to her attention. They're just saying, look, if you had so many ethical reservations about this, why did you go along with him? You're not the lawyer. You're the paralegal. And she just said, my judgment was clouded at the time and things to that effect. But, in all seriousness, I don't think that she did anything wrong from an ethical perspective because she is working for the defense team. And the defense team is supposed to try and win the case. Now, if you were to try and think about what is the right thing to do in those situations, maybe you should go with your moral convictions as opposed to the ethics of a code of conduct. Perhaps. We can talk about that, actually. You can weigh in the comments section down below. I would love to know what you guys think. However, I don't think she did anything wrong because the role of the defense team is to win. The role of the defense attorney is to win for the client, not for anything else. Yes, they know that they're going to be defending murderers. They're going to be defending terrorists, and they're going to be defending people who are accused of sexual harassment. And they have to use certain tactics at their disposal. And is this good? Maybe even not. Maybe it's not a good thing. But I can't always provide you with a better alternative, because if somebody's going to say, yeah, this guy confessed to us via our psychologist that he actually committed the crime, well, I mean, then they're just not going to try. The prosecution could manipulate the emotions of everybody in the courtroom. Yeah, okay, we think he did it. We think he's guilty. All right, everybody go home. People could just start playing with your emotions. And they do. But if the defense team is trying and the prosecution is trying and the judge is watching, saying, they're trying to win, I'm going to keep things fair for the purposes of discussion, that's the best we've got. So I don't think the lawyers did anything wrong, and I don't think the paralegal did anything wrong. She was working for the defense team, and the goal is to try and win. Now, there was another case that came up, though, that was dealing with the ethical challenges of being a lawyer in a completely different aspect. And it was the story of a group of people who had to defend an individual who was accused of trespassing as well as unauthorized entry to a property. In short, he was an undocumented individual in the United States, and he did some work for someone in the agricultural sector. He was the boss was simply called the farmer in this story, and the farmer did not want to pay him. So this guy's like going there once, hey, where's my money? And the guy was told to leave, get off my property, all of that. The guy goes back a second time after being told to leave, and apparently he did something. When I hear unauthorized entry, I think maybe he tried to enter this person's domicile, for lack of a better term. And he's just trying to get his money back, though, just trying to say, hey, I did work for you that you agreed to pay me. Where's my money? It goes to court. And because this guy's an undocumented individual, there is a very big risk. And that is that Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement, ICE, as we call them, was well aware of what was going on. And there was an ICE agent waiting right outside the door. And they're like, all right, the lawyers are thinking, we can get this guy off. We can win. They're accusing him of trespassing and unauthorized entry. We're going to win this case so easily. But if we do, then he's going to be accosted by the ICE agent and most likely deported. So the lawyers are thinking, should we lose the case on purpose? Is that an effective strategy? Should we not try to win for our client? If he loses, he might go to jail for 3 to 6 months. Then he can get out. And during those 3 to 6 months, the team of lawyers can go after the farmer to try to get the money for him. Maybe ICE will forget about him in 6 months. They thought it over, and they decided that that was an impractical choice, that it was not acceptable to try and lose for a client on purpose, that their role was to win. And they did. They won. So the guy's not going to jail. The ICE agent took him from the courthouse, deported him, banned him from future entry to the United States. No money, kicked out of the country. He's gone. Sayonara. Some people would be thinking, the guy's working here illegally. That's on him. He broke the law by coming here illegally. I happen to be one of them. That part of me completely recognizes that you shouldn't be doing that. But from the point of view of the lawyers, which is the focus of this segment that I'm talking to you guys about right now, it's that this is an example of when people are going to be faced with some tough choices, when they're like, if we're supposed to be representing the best interests of our clients, they're like, his best interests are to go to jail for 3 to 6 months, get his money, and stay in America. That's it. Those are his best interests, and I've always said this. From the very beginning, even when I was a kid, and I would hear this stuff about lawyers are looking after your best interests, I'm like, no, they're not. No, they're not. And in all seriousness, this is a perfect example of how they're not looking after your best interest. They are trying to win. They're trying to win the case on your behalf. And that's what that team decided to do. And they didn't do anything wrong, in my opinion. They realized that this is our role in the system. It's not about just like, again, going off of your emotions, deciding what you believe is the most moral choice. That's not what a lawyer does. The lawyer is supposed to try and win the case and not violate any ethical guidelines or do anything that is purely inappropriate solely because they think that their way is better. Now, I told you guys that I often begin the show with some crime talk points, and usually those are the first things that I say. It's just, this is a pre-recorded segment, so it's a little bit thrown off, and just everything about this episode is different. But as far as the crime talk points, though, Crime Talk is hosted by Scott Reich, who's a practicing defense attorney, and he said a very interesting thing, and that was that in a courtroom, a blind witness is useless. A blind witness, meaning somebody who is not familiar with the actions and activities of the case that is being presented, but instead they are just supposed to be an expert about something that is loosely relevant. Like in a case, maybe that first one even, about the lawyer with the harassment issue. They just bring in an expert on domestic violence. This is domestic violence, and these are how domestic violence relationships work. These are signs of domestic violence. And he's like, that stuff's all useless. Because if the expert witness isn't purely related to the events and actions of the case, it's not the best presentation. And meaning, like, you can have an expert witness who isn't extremely well versed in the case. It's just, if they're talking about DNA, yeah, this is DNA evidence. This is how it's collected. These are the DNA results, and this is what is demonstrating that this person's DNA was left at the crime scene. Same thing with ballistics. Same thing with blood spatter. But with something like just an expert on domestic violence that isn't really talking about the actual activities of the case, just saying, these are signs of domestic violence, I agree. But here on Black Box Online Radio, I frequently talk to you guys about the Zodiac Killer. Every Monday, I do an episode about the Zodiac Killer, Zodiac Monday, here on BBO War. And for the Thursday show, instead of the live True Crime Talk Radio in the morning episode, there will be a special bonus episode about the Zodiac Killer, where I'll be discussing the suspect, George Karadanis, someone whom I've never done a standalone suspect profile episode for here on Black Box Online Radio. Now, as far as blind witnesses go, I've definitely done some things like that on Zodiac Monday. And most notably, I was thinking about two episodes that came out recently when I interviewed Sonnet Damont and Kristen Detoni. Sonnet Damont is the author of the upcoming book, When Dangerous Feels Like Home. She is a psychotherapist, and that episode actually started out by just getting a psychologist's perspective on the Zodiac Killer mystery to actually talking about the suspects. And she had a suspect named Robert Christian Hansen. Of course, she's not the only person to have accused Robert Christian Hansen of being the Zodiac Killer, or let's not use the word accused. Having a person of interest. Yes, he is a POI in her mind. Robert Christian Hansen, of course, was a real serial killer called the Butcher Baker, who operated in Anchorage, Alaska. But with the actions of blind witnesses, people like Kristen Detoni and Sonnet Damont perhaps aren't the most familiar with the Zodiac case, yet I still don't regret having them on at all. Kristen Detoni is the author of the book Cryptology Collections, and she looks at ciphers, and the Zodiac Killer wrote ciphers. And I have no regrets having them on the program because I wanted different perspectives. This is not a court of law here. This is some place where we exchange information and ideas, and I'm not necessarily trying to just prove things beyond a reasonable doubt, even if I know that it's not the truth, because that's what lawyers can do. I've already given you the clearest example of how the lawyer is trying to convince a jury, even if their suspect is actually guilty. That guy who was sexually harassing a teenager confessed to it to the psychologist or therapist, and he's just like, yeah, okay, absolutely, I did it. And the lawyer's like, we're going to try and win this case anyway, and they did because they rigged the whole thing by playing to people's emotions and lying. That's not what I want to do on Zodiac Monday. But Kristen Detoni wrote a book where she looks at ciphers from an artistic perspective, and I'm like, okay, well, here are the Zodiac ciphers. What do you think about them? Yes, I'm asking other people what they think about the case. And that is something that I really don't want to remove from any of the shows on Black Box Online Radio, talking to you guys about the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, and D.B. Cooper, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, respectively. But some of the other true crime cases that I've been following come from the channel True Crime Central. Today is Tuesday, and over the weekend, I had the opportunity to go through some of the True Crime Central interviews that are available, and a lot of them are conducted by Piers Morgan, someone whom a lot of people don't really like too much. I happen to be one of them. I've never been the biggest fan of Piers Morgan in the past. Sometimes he would have like an interesting discussion when he was hosting his program on CNN because Piers Morgan took over the interview segment for Larry King from Larry King, and he would have interesting guests. They're talking about a lot of interesting current events, and I found that I of course was disagreeing with Piers a lot, but I still remember a lot of those discussions because it's the way that you can challenge somebody. However, he received a lot of praise for the True Crime Central interviews that were done, and some of them are called, female killers, and this is available on the channel True Crime Central. That's how I'm getting them. They were most likely aired on a different network. And the first interview that I actually watched with him was from years ago when I did the episode on Paris Bennett, who might be one of the clearest examples of a clinical psychopath, someone who murdered his sister and just made this absolutely frantic 911 call, when in all reality, he was completely guilty of it. So I'm watching these True Crime Central interviews with Piers Morgan, and one person that he interviewed was named Erin Caffey, who's also been featured on the Dr. Phil show. And last night I couldn't sleep, so I watched her interview with Dr. Phil, and she is somebody who arranged for the murder of her family. Her two brothers were killed, her mother was killed, her father was shot multiple times, 11 times going off of memory, yet he still survived. And she's referred to as the most dangerous inmate in the prison because she comes across as extremely harmless, 4'11", young lady. She had her whole family murdered. She enlisted the help of 3 different people to carry out the crime, which is completely normal with female murderers. I mean, some of the most frequent ways that women orchestrate murders is just by that, enlisting other people to actually carry it out. And one of the clearest examples that I always go back to is the story of Belle Gunness, who was a serial killer known as Hell's Belle. And she's referred to as a killer, even though she mostly had a male accomplice do the violent acts. But a lot of other female serial killers are involved with poisonings. I can give you countless examples. I've talked about them here on Black Box Online Radio, and even just other murderers who tried to be serial killers and were unsuccessful, like Christiana Edmonds, who was the chocolate cream killer by poisoning chocolate creams. Gwendolyn Graham and Kathy Wood, the girls from Alpine Manor, who were poisoning their patients. And with somebody, though, like Erin Caffey, she enlisted help of other people, 2 men and 1 woman, to murder her family. And the motive that has been described is that she was told to end the relationship with her boyfriend. And she didn't want to do that, and he didn't want to do that. And the boyfriend's actually trying to talk her out of it, saying, let's run away. We're in Texas. Let's go to Maine. Let's cross the country. And she didn't want to do that. She wanted her family murdered. They enlisted the help of a second individual, a second perpetrator, who was behind on child support, so they told him that they would pay him $2,000 to participate in the crime. And then they enlisted the help of a third one, a female. So there are 2 women and 2 men involved with this, but Erin Caffey is mostly just the orchestrator. And that was ultimately her plan. She was going to play the role of being a victim. But the whole thing that threw things off was the father survived, and he was able to tell the story of what happened. They shot everybody in the house. The mother and the 2 brothers died. Then they set the house on fire, and the father still survived. It reminds me a lot of the story of Jennifer Pan, who was responsible for the Tiger Parent murders, although I say the Tiger Parent murders because that's what they're known as. However, Jennifer Pan was somebody who only successfully murdered her mother. And it's done for a rather different issue. With Jennifer Pan, it was mostly because she was living a lie and pretending to be a good student when she had deceived her parents for years, and it just reached a tipping point and a boiling point, and everything went to shit, for lack of a better term. With Erin Caffey, it just seems that she had a very dark and sadistic side to her, a very dark and devious side that she was able to hide from a lot of people. And some people are just absolutely shocked and surprised by this. But one person who's not is me. Black Box Ned, because I talk to you guys about these cases all the time, about women who are exhibiting destructive tendencies, homicidal tendencies. I've already brought up Belle Gunness, Kathy Wood, Gwendolyn Graham, Christiana Edmonds, who, again, committed the crimes differently, but those are still people with homicidal tendencies all the same. And when you're just regularly hearing the story of Eileen Wuornos, or also even like people such as Lizzie Borden, maybe she did it, maybe she didn't, then you recognize that women can be destructive too. And it's not just simply like men are just more prone to these types of thoughts and feelings. Women can have a lot of emotional, like, cloudiness. Women can have emotional imbalances, chemical imbalances, all in the same place. And the study that I always go back to is that women can be just as violent as men if they believe that they will not be faced with any immediate danger. Boy, the father survived, was able to tell the whole story. She's caught, convicted, and arrested. And the case of Erin Caffey really falls into a lot of the stories of body language experts, of people who are trying to look at the story from analyzing her eye movements and her shoulders, her posture, everything. Body language experts. I'm not the biggest body language expert, but one thing that I noticed was even lay people in the comment section during the interviews are pointing out that during the first 5 minutes of the interview, she tries to gauge the person's facial expressions, trying to see what they want to hear so she can tell them what they want to hear. She's trying to go in line with a certain type of emotion to make them like her. And during the True Crime Central interviews, Piers Morgan was told very clearly that the prisoners are going to try and manipulate you. But one thing that I began to notice is that the prisoners really don't seem to have an enormous amount of control. The prisoners don't seem to have an enormous amount of say. The prisoners don't seem to have an enormous amount of leverage. For example, they're in jail, some of them serving life sentences, and if they're just going to get up there and lie in complete contradiction to the evidence, what's there to talk about? And that's the stuff that I think about all the time. And again, this is emotional cloudiness with some people. Other times, it's just blatantly ignoring the facts. And on the Friday show, we were talking about intellectual honesty. When some people don't want to back down from a story if the evidence goes against it. They even brought it up on Crime Talk in relation to the Karen Read case. Innocent until proven guilty, but sometimes there's an enormous amount of evidence that should not be ignored. And those things are very, very important to examine. So with this case of Erin Caffey, no matter what, even if some way she was able to put on a facade, make the interviewer like her, then what real benefit does that do for her? Is he going to vouch for her behalf on national television? That's probably as best as she could afford, but why would the interviewer just go along with her emotions if they had all of the evidence in front of them? And that's one thing that, some of these more famous interviewers out there that I've listed off did not seem to do. They didn't go along with the emotions. They looked at the evidence. And I think just after conducting hundreds of thousands of interviews, some people like that can separate the chicken shit from the chicken salad. Maybe I should have just said the wheat from the chaff. That's a little bit of a better example. But in terms of listening to people who think that they're master manipulators and master persuaders, a lot of people on True Crime Central who are serving life sentences without the possibility of parole maintain their innocence. Even in the face of contradictory evidence, they maintain their innocence. And I'm just thinking, I understand completely. I don't agree with what they did. They were completely wrong for doing so, but I understand completely. Because it's their only way out of prison. Their only way out of the prison is to get people to just kind of doubt the facts. They have nothing else to do. They're just going to say, yeah, I murdered all those people, and I don't feel bad about it. That's not going to help their case. They're going to be like, yeah, I murdered all those people. I feel bad about it. That's not going to help their case either. Life without the possibility of parole. And someone's feelings change? No. But if they can get someone to believe them that they're innocent, publicize the story, it's kind of hard, though, to deny basic hard evidence, though. Well, I wanted this to be a short episode of True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. I just wanted to check in with you guys, talk about some of the true crime cases that I'm exploring, and I'll be with you next week for another round of live streams every Tuesday and Thursday, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And please feel free to stop by this Thursday for the bonus episode on the Zodiac killer suspect, George Karadanis. I'm Black Box Ned, and see you next time.